I do think publishers have an opportunity now, particularly in a potential third-party deprecated cookie world, where not paywalls, but registration walls and things like that, where you just start to talk a little bit about it is, we provide the greatest sports stats in the world, whatever it is, please register for our newsletter so that we can send you periodic updates that helps us pay our bills. Okay. I love this site. I come to it twice a month. That's a little kind of mini transaction you can do. It adds some value for the publisher. We've started to kind of paint that picture. I mentioned it earlier, like the ad block recovery thing. That's a pretty blatant example of it. But I think there's subtle ways that you can do it. You don't have to beat the people over the head with it, but just remind them that, there's great people doing great work here to create this content. And they're doing it because they're passionate about it too. I mean, honestly, the publishing world is tough right now, particularly in the world of generative AI. There's a lot of content categories, particularly like recipe sites and things that are in a tough spot because you can just type it in Gen AI, it spits it out, goes and scrapes the content that wonderful content creators made, and they're not getting credit for it. We've seen that in some traffic trends across various sites and specific verticals. It's tough out there. And honestly, Google, Facebook, Twitter, I guess X, are keeping more traffic in-house than they've ever kept before. So it's tough out there. And if there's anything we can do to help paint the picture of there are great people creating this content, please support them. And a little more human version of it, you can probably get people to opt in to certain things slightly and at least think about the fact that there is somebody that had to create this. I mean, will admit, I think most people are like, oh, it's just there. Like my kids, they'll be playing a game or something. They see an ad like, oh, these ads. I'm like, that ad pays the mortgage around here, guys. Come on, this is important. It's a roof over your head. And even they know that, but they don't even think about it.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the e-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Super excited to be chatting with Kurt Donnell today, who is the CEO of Freestar, which is involved in the monetization side mostly of the internet advertising ecosystem. Thanks for joining me, Kurt.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. You're a busy man. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule for doing this, I think.
My pleasure. So the first thing I wanted to sort of touch on is sort of the different ways in which, content has been supported through advertising over the years, even pre-internet, right? I mean, people sort of understood when they watched network TV that there were going to be there was going to be advertising. When they flipped through the magazines and newspapers, they sort of figured, all right, I get it. Some of this is advertising. And in the situation for Cosmo, the fall issues, the advertising was so good, people were delighted by it, right? They were like, it was as important as the editorial was. But I sort of feel like along the way, in the internet, that sort of has broken. So I'd love to get your thoughts as to sort of how should the ecosystem evolve to sort of make sure that the internet can continue to sort of be free to the extent that it's not subscriber content and sort of float all boats higher. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we've done just a terrible job, frankly, from the publishing side of explaining the value exchange. I mean, you wouldn't expect your cable to just show up for free or your newspaper to show up for free, but somehow the internet's supposed to show up for free because we never really talked about it. And it never started out as a subscription model like those did, where they became ad supported. And we're seeing that obviously in the streaming space right now, whether it's ad supported Netflix, it's subsidized or whatever that is. This the internet kind of started out for free and it was subsidized forever with ads. And that has certainly proliferated over time in different formats and everything, but there never was the value exchange clearly laid out up front. And I think it's been on us as the publisher of not doing a good job about that. I think in instances where people have ad blockers and things, we do take that moment sometimes to, pop up that little modal that says, hey, we're providing all the world's information for free. Maybe you could see some ads and help us pay for doing that. But outside of those instances, we've not done that. Obviously, there's been a number of subscription models that have been tried over time. And I think a few people have done a good job with that, whether it's New York Times or Wall Street Journal. But I think outside of maybe 20, 30 websites on the whole internet, it's going to be a struggle. And so I think we are in a world where it is going to be an advertising supported environment forever to some extent, and really explain that to users what that means is something we need to do, particularly in a world where consent and everything is popping up, and it's easy to hit reject all, and then it gets harder and harder to monetize things and frankly pay the writers that create all the great content. So I think it is a little bit of an education piece that publishers need to own from that side, to be quite honest.
Yeah, you make some great points there. One fascinating thing that I thought of as you were saying that is there was sort of an automatic economic regulator in many of the other channels, whether it was TV advertising, radio advertising, print advertising, and that it was expensive enough that somebody on the marketing side had to think through, like, okay, in order for me to afford this, my ad's going to have to probably be pretty relevant.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the internet, the premise or the promise of the internet is that relevance. But as a result of sort of the, supply and demand ecosystem sometimes being out of alignment, consumers didn't always get the most relevant advertising. So, that economic governor sort of broke in the internet as well. And so it is fixing that part of the equation as well.
I think so to some extent. I mean, it goes to everybody's favorite podcast topic a little bit, targeting and cookies and all of those things. But I think obviously relevant ads make a better experience from my standpoint. They've done a bunch of studies about it, which is sort of the antithetical element of getting rid of cookies and getting less targeted ads is it makes a
Right,
worse
right.
user experience.
Yeah.
Well, my wife loves women's shoes. They're not really my thing. And so if I've got an ad and I'm on ESPN and a bunch of women's shoes are popping up, it's going to be a bit of a jarring, strange experience. So I actually think people prefer relevant advertising. Are there ways you can do that contextually and with some other signals that are maybe less privacy invasive in quotes? I suppose you can do that, but it is a little strange that we're fighting against targeted ads when the alternative is untargeted, more jarring ads. It's such a strange thing. My view on this is I think that consumers don't want, frankly, Facebook and Google and people following them around. The irony here is they'll never go log out of Google or Facebook or any of those things such that they won't get followed around. And it ends up hurting the open web, which are the publishers that create all the incredible content that they want, where the targeted advertising and makes it more relevant and a better user experience for them. So we've got this weird kind of mix of reasons why things are happening. It's not going to hurt the people that it maybe should or that people think that it would. And it maybe hurts their user experience. So I think it's a pretty strange conundrum, frankly, in what we're trying to accomplish. And I don't fault the regulators for trying to get regulators or even Google, I guess, for playing along on addressing privacy. Those things are real, but I think it has some perverse outcomes, to be quite frank.
Yeah, and to what extent do some of those perverse outcomes are they driven by a couple of bad actors, right? Because often when regulators and legislators get excited about a topic, it's as a result of these outlier cases, not the majority of something happening. And so, you do hear these, horror stories about, malware or situations where, ads were objectionable, right, in some way. And do you feel like that has been a catalyst for sort of some of the over-regulation or over-legislation that we're dealing with now?
Think people love to grab onto the outlier in anything in life. We serve literally billions and billions of ads every month across the call it 1,000 websites we represent. And we will get occasionally a complaint from a website owner like, oh my God, we had one user complain about this bad ad. I'm like, you served 100 million ads last month and you had one user complain. That's pretty darn good odds. But
Right.
if you grasp onto the one user that complained, like you can make any kind of case you want. And I think that's the same thing. I don't know about you. Maybe you have different friends. I can't tell you last time I heard a friend say I got a virus on my computer, certainly not from an ad. Like this isn't a thing that really happens. I mean, hypothetically it does, but I don't know the last time it's happened. And maybe you're closer with the marketing association. You hear about this happening. I just don't hear about it. So I think I don't want to say urban legend, but it seems like something where somebody grabbed a outlier and turned it into a narrative that became a thing that really we're solving a problem that doesn't exist to some extent from at least that standpoint. I mean, some of the privacy stuff I think is real, but the malware element of it, I just don't think is real. I'm curious, I guess, have you heard much about that of late or marketers or anybody you talk to complaining about it?
Yeah, I mean, the first party anecdotal stuff you really do not hear. It's again the press covering it, which is somewhat ironic because the press are supported by ads. So for the
Oh,
press
yeah.
to rail against ads is a little bit perverse as well, in that they've helped create the problem that pays their salaries.
Yeah. Well, and the whole made for advertising thing is like we're getting rid of made for advertising. Like the internet literally is made for advertising. That is the definition. The arbitrage stuff, that's a whole different story. But I mean, come
Right.
on, every website's made for advertising, right?
Every piece of content, if it's supported by
Yeah.
advertising, is made for advertising. There's also obviously been a lot of a shift over the years, right? The early internet, right? The IAB banners were sort of systematized, and they everyone sort of decided these are the sizes we're
Yeah.
going to use. And then, rich media came around, and then you've got sort of obviously video is in the mix in so many different ways, right? From the CTV and OTT and even video within banners, right? There's
Yeah.
sort of been this evolution, and to some extent, it's been the marketer trying to say, well, I got to break through the clutter, right?
Hmm.
But the other marketers have sort of said, well, I really do want to tell a story, and I want to delight
Hmm.
the consumer with that story, and I can't do it with a 3-frame animated GIF, right? It's just not going to happen, or a 5-frame
Sure.
animated GIF. So, where does that fit into the future of the internet, right? As it relates to marketers wanting to break through the clutter, but in the best possible way.
Yeah, I think video certainly, is having more of a moment now. It's been having a moment for a while, but it is really changing. I think people are being more honest about what it was. I think a lot of people burying their head in their sand and pretending like everything was like full screen players, click to play, sound on, which we all know it has not been for a very, very long time. And then the folks that kind of built the more formal outstream businesses kind of standardized that, and then the in-banner stuff. I think it all comes back to advertiser outcomes, and they can say that they only want this premium thing, but if something else is working, it's a 6-second video running in a banner ad slot and it works, isn't that ultimately what we want? So I think it really comes down to efficacy of the advertisement, whether that's display, video, native. You mentioned the Cosmo thing, like the original native ad maybe were those things in the Cosmo magazine, but it's all backing into the outcome, and that will get, it's a relatively efficient market. There's a little bit of arbitrage, but most things are priced fairly efficiently such that the performance of the ad should get priced into it, and that goes into the format and all of these things over time. There's periods of time, I think, where we're all adjusting. I think CTV rates a year or two ago were probably a piece of that, where they were astronomically high but probably not driving the outcomes they should, and then it probably adjusted accordingly. Like any efficient market, it should work itself out. So I think things are going to evolve. I think we'll see shorter videos. We're already starting to see some more kind of social vertical video content popping up. There's some companies doing that stuff, and like everything in the internet, it'll change every 6 months. And I think that's a good thing. I actually left the industry for a couple years thinking that's ad tech, whatever, and realized I missed that. Like the fun of this whole thing is, what is that new challenge? And whether it's privacy or it's the mobile or it's video or it's whatever the next thing is, that's the fun stuff that we got to figure out. And the marketer on their side should too. And they should be pushing the envelope and not be afraid that this is, what we've always done. And I'll get renewed if I just buy a bunch of YouTube or whatever. It's like push the envelope and drive outcomes. I mean, that is what this really comes down to. It is marketing. That is the goal of the entire thing. And so I think it will continue to evolve as it comes to sort of the standards around this stuff. It's interesting because the internet's made up. I mean, it's only been a commercially viable thing for what, 25 years in a real fashion. And it's always been made up and then written down later. Like the standards have always followed whatever happened because this thing became, and like the video classification of in-stream and outstream and all that stuff. That stuff was happening for years, and it's finally getting classified correctly now. And that's just the nature of this. The next new thing will happen, and then we'll have to figure out how do we classify that. But that's a good thing. It's what makes this fun. It gives marketers on your side the opportunity to try new things. And I think it's important. And so trying to put things in a box just doesn't really work. Also trying to guess what's going to work in 3 years, I have no idea. If you told me TikTok was going to be a thing and my kids would like beg to watch videos that are, I don't know, 10 seconds long all the time, I would have told you you're nuts. But they figured something out, right?
Absolutely. So your team is often quite consultative with the publishers because obviously they've got a certain amount of impression inventory, whatever it is, and
Yeah.
they want to maximize yield, but at the same time, if they, you know, get too aggressive in ad load, right, then the consumer's experience
Mhm.
suffers, right? So I'm sure that they're discussing with you sort of what's that sweet spot because, you know, they could be perhaps short-sighted if they're trying
Yeah.
to maximize revenue on the short term, and damaging the industry, to be honest. I mean,
Mhm.
there's certainly a lot of websites that have probably helped facilitate the ad blocker, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
the ad load was insane that you would see there. So, how are you advising publishers now with regards to sort of finding that line, from a yield maximization perspective, but keeping consumer experience in mind?
Yeah, of course, a delicate balance. I mean, I think it really comes down to maximizing revenue per session, not revenue per page view or even CPM. It's interesting. We work with a host of clients. We represent, like I said, about 1,000 different websites, all sorts of different verticals, many of which have worked with other people, many of which have done this in-house, and they often will come with a bias that, well, my fill rate's down or my CPM's down or whatever that is, or CPM's up a ton and whatever that is. Like good, bad, ugly, any of those things. What ultimately matters is revenue per session because it takes into account that I come up with a thoughtful layout that's going to keep the person on there the optimal amount of time. And then you put the right ads in front of them that balance that. So you're making sure that you're optimizing the value of that user. And it is really a balance between the user experience and the ad layout and all of those things. And so it's consultative and always tweaking and looking at that and being thoughtful. I'd say we err on the side usually of user experience slightly. You just don't want to end up on one of those pages that is one of those MFA true made for advertising or arbitrage or whatever you say it. Like get on it. Like it's hard to define, but it is one of those things. Like it when you see it. You get on one, you're like, oh, they're buying some traffic here. And so you want to avoid that feeling, but at the same time, we've got to optimize revenue. We talk a lot about not just adding more, but can we be more thoughtful? We take away 2 display units and add a video unit because the RPM increases there. You're not spamming the user with 3 ads. You back to just 1 ad instead of 2, but you've maximized revenue. And so it's always a balance. We've
Right.
built a lot of technology that does that very dynamically, which is great. Our affectionately known dynamic ad stack really optimizes all different elements of that, elements of the auction dynamics of client side versus server side and timeouts and a host of different things, what layouts should be to make sure we strike that right balance, but ultimately making sure that users aren't bouncing matters as much as anything. Flip side is you can optimize CPM all you want, but you can sell one impression for $1 million. It's not probably going to be the best. $1 million CPM once is not going to really pan out for you. So there's balance to this whole thing of floors and all the different things that come to it, but ultimately it's revenue per session.
Right. Right. Going back to this idea that the consumer hasn't properly been explained the sort of quid pro quo of the fact that it took
Yeah,
energy to create this content. There were humans involved, hopefully, although AI generated content is starting to show up in
yeah.
some places. But humans, the better content is still generated by humans, and should the industry trade associations take a stronger role here in sort of educating the consumer? I think I can only remember once, it's got to have been 10, 12 years ago, where somebody created a campaign with a penguin that was supposed to explain how the internet worked and the fact that it was important that that the advertising be there, right?
Yeah.
But other than that, I'm not even sure I could dig that up, that particular banner ad. But at a certain point, I think the industry trade associations have an opportunity here to educate. And should they be the ones doing it? Should the bigger publishers be doing it? Where should the consumer learn about the fact that there's sort of a fairness in allowing themselves to see ads?
Yeah, I think putting on the trade organizations is tough, and I don't even know how they would do it. I mean, they're going to run ads on podcasts and Spotify. Well, like the
Right,
open internet is supported by ads. Like I don't even know where you would do that to some
right,
extent. So there's that bit. I do think publishers have an opportunity now, particularly in a potential third-party deprecated cookie world, where not paywalls, but registration walls and things like that, where you just start to talk a little bit about it is, we provide the greatest sports stats in the world, whatever it is. Please register for our newsletter so that we can send you periodic updates that helps us pay our bills. Okay. I love this site. I come to it twice a month. That's a little kind of mini transaction you can do. It adds some value for the publisher. We've started to kind of paint that picture. I mentioned it earlier, like the ad block recovery thing. That's a pretty blatant example of it. But I think there's subtle ways that you can do it. You don't have to beat the people over the head with it, but just remind them that, there's great people doing great work here to create this content. And they're doing it because they're passionate about it too. I mean, honestly, the publishing world is tough right now, particularly in the world of generative AI. There's a lot of content categories, particularly like recipe sites and things that are in a tough spot because you can just type it in Gen AI, it spits it out, goes and scrapes the content that wonderful content creators made, and they're not getting credit for it. We've seen that in some traffic trends across various sites and specific verticals. It's tough out there. And honestly, Google, Facebook, Twitter, I guess X, are keeping more traffic in-house than they've ever kept before. So it's tough out there. And if there's anything we can do to help paint the picture of there are great people creating this content, please support them. And a little more human version of it, you can probably get people to opt in to certain things slightly and at least think about the fact that there is somebody that had to create this. I mean, will admit, I think most people are like, oh, it's just there. Like my kids, they'll be playing a game or something. They see an ad like, oh, these ads. I'm like, that ad pays the mortgage around here, guys. Come on, this is important. It's a roof over your head. And even they know that, but they don't even think about it.
Right, right. Um, the AI generated content is sort of an existential crisis,
Yeah.
potentially for the ecosystem. Where would you expect to see that going?
I think it's a moment in time right now where we haven't all figured out all of its capabilities in relevant ways. It's very interesting, and we've worked it into elements of our business, like the ability for our support team, for instance, be able to query all of the information we have internally in 2 seconds. It's amazingly useful. I'm a big believer that AI lets us exceed human potential, and I think that's a really good thing. I think there's ways that needs to or can be harnessed more. We haven't figured all of those out yet. So I tend to be a pretty glass half full person in life, and I'm actually very glass half full about AI. It's going to change probably what content production everything looks like now, but we're an industry that changes a lot and figures it out. I mean, we've gone from hell newspapers to TV to digital on phones to automatically injected ads into gaming environments. Like things will continue to change. And I believe if we all lean into it, we'll find the ways that there's benefits of AI. Are there going to be some casualties along the way? Surely, because there always are. But I don't think that it's a bad thing. I mean, I was reading something that the amount of innovation in the next 10 years will be like 150 years worth or something because of that. And as long as we all lean into it and figure out the ways that can help us all get better, I don't think it kills things. And like any revolution, like industrial revolution, things actually creates more jobs before it takes them away. So I think we got a really unique moment to be part of shaping the future of that too. Like it's an amazing time to be alive.
One thing that I'd be curious to get your take on as well is there are sort of influencers that sprung up within each of their channels, right? You've got Mr.
Mhm.
Beast, who's mostly on YouTube, and then you've got Instagrammers and you've got TikTokers, and each of the algorithms is a little bit different. Some of them focus more on the individual, some of them focus more on the specific content, and the content can sort of break out. And then you've got influencers that were essentially created by their broadcast entities, or in some cases, print entities, right? So if you think about some broadcast journalists or talking heads
Yeah.
on some of these channels, their social media profiles are actually pretty significant. In some cases, their follower counts rival or maybe even exceed
Yeah.
their parent organization, which is almost like a Frankenstein situation, right? The
Hmm.
organization created this gave this person their footprint, and now their footprint is gigantic. Um, One thing I'm sort of starting to see is some of these folks are realizing that they have to act a little bit like a publisher, right?
Oh,
So they're
yeah.
starting to say, just like publishers are saying, wait a minute, I need first party data. These influencers are starting to say, well, you know what? Like, I don't even have an email newsletter. Like, I built my entire house of
Yeah.
cards on Instagram or my entire house of cards on TikTok or YouTube. And they're starting to say, I need a personal relationship with these individuals. I need that same value exchange, that same quid pro quo where person trades me their email address or their SMS
Yeah.
or, you know, they're finally discovering email, which is of course ironic since they're you know
Yes.
21 years old and they never even use email. But
Yeah.
so any thoughts on sort of that evolution where it used to be like the brand, the CNN or the Fox or the Newsweek mattered, and now like you've got the
Yeah.
individual writers and or broadcasters who matter, right? Separately from those, and yet everyone is out there sort of creating the content. Um, does it create the ultimate meritocracy where like the good stuff floats to the surface, right? Is there still as much value to the aggregation brands, or is it really more about the individual creators?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it's the generation or the evolution of whether it's YouTube and Instagram, just frankly social media. There wasn't the opportunity to kind of be a media company of one in the past. And
Right.
ironically enough, my wife is sort of like an influencer, I guess, in some ways. She has a like kind of fashion on a budget type business that she built on Instagram. And it was her own brand that, 10 years ago, that platform, or at least 15 years ago, that platform didn't really exist. And hers started as a blog. And then there's the opportunity to create an Instagram page. And now it's all Instagram and pictures because that works rather well in fashion, as you'd imagine. But there just wasn't the opportunity to do that in the past. And so you had to go tune into CNN or Fox or whatever it was to find your favorite talking head. They've gotten to the point where they have their own channels, or in some instances, I guess, creating almost their own social networks in some extreme examples, I suppose. But I think it's just a sign of the times, and part of like what I said earlier about the evolution of things. It's never going to be the same. Does that make it good or bad? I don't know. You can be like, oh, things were better in my day about it, but it is the nature of things. You can be a anybody can be a content company one way or the other. You think about like the dude perfect guys that were just doing dumb trick shots to have a freaking headquarters, I think in Texas or somewhere, and branding and merchandising and all of that stuff because they were able to create a media company of, I guess in that case, a few guys. But I think it's just that the platforms have given you that opportunity in a good way. YouTube and maybe to a lesser extent, some of the meta brands have democratized that and made it possible, but also gave it the ability to be a business. I mean, Mr. Beast and YouTube, like the amount of money people are making from that stuff is crazy. The amount of money that Google's making from it is even more, but it is impressive what they've been able to do. But they build a loyal following, much like any other brand does. They just happen to use that medium. I mean, separately, you look at brands like what Red Bull has done forever with Red Bull Media House, or what Liquid Death does now with their incredible advertising. They built a brand that's more than canned water. I mean, it's ridiculous, or like mildly bad tasting energy drink, like, you know, but you've made a media brand out of it. And they did that through traditional channels originally, and certainly have transitioned that into the more modern channels. But I think it's sort of that same thing, but the people get to be the brand now. And that just didn't exist because there wasn't the platform to do it, which
Yeah.
I think it's a natural evolution, though, which we've got the opportunity to do. And it would have been pretty odd if that didn't happen, I guess. If everybody just like the CNN folks just went on the CNN Instagram page or something, it'd be strange.
That's true. One of the things that had just occurred to me that never took root, and I actually don't really know why, and maybe you've been sort of also watching it, was this idea that, between ad supported and subscription was this idea of the sort of microtransaction, right?
Yep.
Person could somehow have some kind of a wallet like an Easy Pass where it would take out a couple of cents to read
Mhm.
an article or whatever. And I sort of feel like now almost like AI has gotten in the way of that, right? Because if
Yeah.
AI is going to basically circumvent you even having to go to the content owner's page, then the microtransaction it won't have to happen. Maybe the AIs will be held to account, right, for
Yeah.
this sort of not being under fair use, right? And they'll have to sort of aggregate up the value of the subscription fees that they're collecting and send it back to the content creators via some kind of as cappy kind of thing, that exists, right? But I was always shocked that microtransactions, there was never sort of a centralized PayPal or a sort of Easy Pass style system that would collect, 3 to 5 cents for a read.
Mhm.
And any thoughts as to why that never happened, or will it ever happen?
Well, I always thought it was an interesting idea. I think the problem is human nature and people's laziness and unwillingness to go through any barrier to entry to anything. And outside of, I mean, I said it earlier, I think there's what, 30 or 50 websites on the internet that are worth a subscription.
Yeah.
Outside of that, you can probably go find most of what you want someplace else. And so if there's a slight barrier to entry, you just hit the back button and click on the second link on Google. And that's the ultimate problem with the whole thing, is outside of people that I would be willing to pay because I love their stuff and I'd sign up for their Patreon or whatever that is. already, the 2 cents is even just a pain in the ass. 'Cause, what's my login for whatever the thing is? Or I mean, it'd have to be wildly, wildly easy
Yeah,
and fairly compelling. And I think you'd almost have to ask afterwards. Maybe that's the value exchange, or you
interesting.
get 2/3 of the way down and be like, unlock the rest for a penny. I think, okay, I'll do a penny, something like that. I mean, I think it'd have to be rethought a little bit, but I think any barrier to entry is a barrier in something like this. And it's why ads work, because people have this perception. And it goes back to the very, I think, first thing we talked about. The internet's free. Like I never had to pay for it. I get all the world's information for free because we made it so out of the gates. And I think it's why advertising will continue to support the internet for a very, very long time. And it just doesn't probably become a subscription model because everybody's raised that way and trained that way. And somebody's going to figure out a way to give it away cheaper, faster, AI, whatever that is. So I loved the idea of it when it first popped out. I think human psychology is the problem there, honestly, of like, I got to do some work to get this thing. I'm good.
Right. So one more sort of more hands-on question as it relates to the different types of publishers that you see out there. Some of them have pretty strong contextual signals, right? And
Yeah.
so to some extent, they haven't been impacted as negatively by the continued loss of signal within Safari
Yeah.
or Firefox or eventually Chrome. Um, and some of them like news, right? They don't have strong contextual signal at all. So we've got like these data haves and data have-nots and sort of this asymmetry with regards to yield. Do you feel like anybody's going to be able to sort of solve that? Are the identity graphs going to be the way that it gets solved, or is there something else that solves that?
Think contextual is a bit of a tough sell because we spent the last 10 years telling everybody contextual doesn't work and you need better targeting and we've got all the answers and the data and everything. Like, just kidding. 10 years later, no, no, no. Actually, contextual is the thing, man. We got to get back to that contextual thing. I think that's tough. I think, quite honestly, cookies don't go away until there's something that's very similar to a cookie that allows relatively the same level of targeting, relatively same level of attribution back to the advertisers. I actually pressed Google on this to their face last week in Cannes at a meeting. I'm like, the real reason you're not getting rid of cookies yet is you haven't figured out with your advertiser, right? They're like, no, 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 we swear. I'm like, you do run the biggest advertising business in the entire world, right? And until the advertisers are getting the outcomes they want, they probably don't want to screw with that too much. And they swear there's church and state between the Chrome team and the ads team and all of that stuff. But if you do zoom out and like the classic follow the money here, like Google cares about advertisers advertising with Google and through Google pipes and into Google ecosystems. So there's a lot of incentives, I think, for them to make sure that advertisers get the right outcomes. And there's incentives for everybody. The whole digital media industry wins if advertisers are getting what they want. And if you just instantly get rid of third-party cookies or whatever the targeting signals are, you hurt the advertiser, you hurt the publisher. Like nobody really wins in that circumstance. And like I said earlier, in the perverse outcome, I don't even think the user of the website wins because they get shoes or something. And that's where context, I guess, comes in. You can see that I'm reading, a golf article on ESPN, serve me golf clubs, but you should serve me Titleist ads or Mizuno ads because I'm a Mizuno guy. Like I just am. And so like not, well, I do like Titleist too. Maybe it's a bad example, but not a TaylorMade guy. I know that for sure. So, even those instances where you try to use context for it, it's not necessarily helpful. And so my personal view is I don't think third-party cookies really go away till there's a viable option because there's too many dollars involved for too many different people to let that happen. And nobody really wins.
Yeah, that's a valid point. And the consumer, Google claims to be very consumer centric. So the fact that consumers are going to see considerably crappier ads as a result, they can
Right?
wear the white, the white Ranger hat and say, no, it's for the consumer that we haven't pulled the plug on this yet. Because I don't know that most consumers are that hypersensitive to privacy that they're willing to, see considerably worse ads in exchange
No,
for.
I mean, I just don't think it's good for anybody. It's always perplexed me of what we're trying to solve for here. It's one of those, like, I think we wrote a bad problem statement somewhere along the lines, or people don't really understand this or trying to solve a problem.
Absolutely. So, what else should we have talked about that we haven't talked about as it relates to the sort of the future of the internet and it remaining free?
I do think a lot of the stuff that's kind of been done about supply path optimization and cleaning up the arbitrage stuff is good. I mean, those sites have certainly robbed very quality publishers of some dollars that probably should have gone there. So I think the general cleaning up of the internet is a good thing. I think some of it maybe goes too far, and Gareth writes a really interesting thing about how paid traffic is not necessarily bad and there's different flavors of it. So I think defining what is good and what is bad is a tough thing to do because it's not a one size fits all description of it. But I think the general cleaning up of the supply side is good. I think the completing cleaning up of the supply path is good as well. Like we don't need 15 different hops. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of the future of the SSP. Do we need 50 SSPs or do we need 5, 7, 10? I don't know what that number is. And all of them are trying to figure out their unique propositions, and tons of friends at SSPs and love them. But I don't know that we need all 50 of them unless there really is a unique value prop. And then you get into, do we need DSPs and SSPs? So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to play out. But I do think we're making progress in ways of cleaning things up, a little more efficiency, a little more vertical integration, which any mature industry ultimately does. We're just not that mature as an industry, given it's been around for 25 years. And it's changed so much in that time. And so in the best way, we are figuring things out. And it's why I still have so much optimism for the future, is we're going to continue to figure them out and figure out better ways to do things that win on both sides of the sort of value exchange, from the publisher to the demand side. So glass half full about all of it. There's going to be a lot changing, but that's why we signed up for this crazy gig, right?
Well, we are excited to get up every day and see what the adventure is for that day.
For sure. For sure. It's never a dull moment. I know that.
Thanks, Kurt, for joining me and for sharing your wisdom about the history and the future of the internet.
Absolutely, Kevin. It's a pleasure.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.